everyone, how are you? Welcome back to my channel, DP211 with Emma. And if you're new here, I'd love for you to hang out with me just a little bit longer. Right, hit that subscribe button, ring notification bell, and every time I upload a video to the YouTube reviews, you will be notified on your iPad, your tablet, your phone, your watch, your computer, possibly your TV. You know how to do that one. And if you're returning, welcome back. It's so good to see you. I do miss you when you're not here. So welcome everybody to the second installment of Friday Night Story Time. We will continue with Before the Coffee Gets Cold. We're going to crack on with the second story, and I do hope you enjoy. The cafe has no air conditioning. It opened in 1874, more than 140 years ago. Back then, people still used oil lamps for light. Over the years, the cafe underwent a few small renovations, but its interior today is pretty much unchanged from its original look. When it opened, the decor must have been considered very avant-garde. The commonly accepted date for the appearance of the modern cafe in Japan is around 1888, a whole 14 years later. Coffee was introduced to Japan in the Edo period, around the late 17th century. Initially, it didn't appeal to Japanese taste buds. It was certainly not thought of as something one drank for enjoyment, which was no wonder, considering it tastes like black, bitter water. When electricity was introduced, the cafe switched to oil lamps for electric lights, but installing an air conditioner would have destroyed the charm of the interior. So to this day, the cafe has no air conditioning. But every year, summer comes around. When midday temperatures soar to above 30 degrees Celsius, you would expect a shop, even one that's underground, to be sweltering inside. The cafe does have a large bladed ceiling fan, which, being electric, must have been added later. But a ceiling fan like this doesn't generate a strong breeze and simply serves to make the air circulate. The hottest temperature ever recorded in Japan was 41 degrees Celsius in Kawasaki in the Kochi prefecture. It is difficult to imagine a ceiling fan being at all useful in such heat, but even in the height of summer, this cafe is always pleasantly cool. Who is keeping it cool? Beyond the staff, no one knows, nor will be able to know. It was an afternoon in summer. It was only early in the season, but temperature outside was as high as on any midsummer day. Inside the cafe, a young woman seated at the counter was busy writing. Next to her was an iced coffee diluted by melting ice. The woman was dressed for summer in a white frilled t-shirt, a tight grey miniskirt and strappy sandals. She sat with her back straight, her pen raised across cherry blossom pink letter paper. Standing behind the counter, a slender woman of pale complexion looked on, her eyes filled with a youthful sparkle. It was Kai Tokita, and the contents of the letter had no doubt piqued her curiosity. Occasionally, she would take sneak peeks with a look of childlike fascination on her face. Apart from the woman at the counter who was writing the letter, the other customers in the cafe were the woman in the white dress sitting in that chair and the man named Fusagi, who was sitting at the table seat closest to the entrance. Fusagi once again had a magazine opened on the table. The woman writing the letter drew a deep breath. Kai followed by taking a deep breath herself. "Sorry for being here so long," the woman said, inserting her finished letter in an envelope. "Not at all," Kai said, fleetingly glancing down at her feet. Do you think you could pass this to my sister?" The woman was grasping the letter-filled envelope with two hands and presenting it to Kai politely. Her name was Kumi Harai. She was the younger sister of the cafe regular, Eko Harai. "Ah, well, if I know your sister," Kai thought the better of continuing and bit her lip. Kumi tilted her head slightly and gave Kai an inquisitive look, but Kai simply smiled as if she meant nothing by it. "Okay, I'll pass it on to her," she said, looking at the letter Kamai was holding. Kamai hesitated a little. "I know she might not even read it. If you could," she said, bowing her head low. Kai assumed the correct and polite stance. "Of course I will," she said, acting as if she was being entrusted with something extremely important. She received the letter with both hands and made a courteous bow while Kamai moved to the cash register. "How much?" Kamai asked, handing Kai the bill. Kai carefully placed the letter on the counter. Then she took the bill and began punching the keys of the cash register. This cafe's cash register had to be a contender for the oldest one still in use. Although it hadn't been in the cafe right from the beginning, its keys was much like the one of those of a typewriter, and it was introduced to the cafe at the beginning of the Showa period in about 1925. This was a very solidly built cash register, designed to prevent theft. Its frame alone weighed about 40 kilograms. It made a noisy clank every time a key was punched. Coffee and toast, curry rice, mixed parfait, clank, 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 clank. Kai rhythmically punched in the amount of each order: ice cream soda, pizza toast. Kamai certainly seemed to have eaten a lot. In fact, not everything fitted on one bill. Kai began punching in the orders of the second bill: curry pilaf, banana float, cutlet curry. Normally it's not necessary to read out each item, but Kai didn't mind doing it. The sight of her punching in the amounts resembled a child happily immersed in playing with a toy. Then you had the gorgonzola gnocchi and the chicken and the perilla cream pasta. I sort of pied out, didn't I? Said Kimi in a rather loud voice, perhaps a little embarrassed at having everything read out. Please, you don't have to read it all out, was probably what she wanted to say. You certainly did. Of course, it wasn't Kai who said this. It was Fusagi. Having heard the order being read out, he had muttered this softly while he continued to read his magazine. Kai ignored him, but Kumi's ears went a rosy pink. How much? Kumi asked. But Kai had not finished. Let's see. Then there was the mixed sandwich, held onigiri, second curry rice, and the iced coffee. Comes to a total of 10,230 yen. Kai smiled, her round sparkling eyes showing nothing but kindness. Okay then, here you go, Kamai said, as she quickly pulled out 2 notes from her purse. Kai took the notes and counted them efficiently. Receiving 11,000 yen, she said, as she punched the keys of the cash register. Kamai waited with her head hung low. The cash drawer opened with a jolt and Kai pulled out the change. That's 770 yen change. Smiling once again with her round sparkling eyes, Kai gave Kamai the change. Kamai bowed her head politely. Thank you, it was delicious. Perhaps because she was embarrassed that all the things she had eaten had been read aloud. Kamai now seemed eager to leave quickly, but just as she was going, Kai called out to stop her. Kamai, she said. Kamai stopped in her tracks and looked back at her. About your sister, Kai said, and glanced down at her feet. Is there any message you would like me to give her? She held both hands up in the air as she asked. No, it's okay. I wrote it in the letter, Kamai said without hesitation. Yes, I imagine you did. Kai furrowed her brow as if disappointed. Perhaps touched that Kai showed concern, Kamai grinned and said after a moment's thought, perhaps there's something you could say. Yes, of course. Kai's expression brightened instantly. Tell her that neither Dad nor Mum is angry anymore. Your father and mother are angry anymore, Kai repeated. Yes, please tell her that. Kai's eyes were once again round and sparkling. She nodded twice. Okay, I will, she said happily. Kamai looked around the cafe and once more bowed politely to Kai before she left. Kai went over to the entrance to check that Kamai had gone, and then with a quick pirouette, she started talking to the vacant counter. Did you have a fight with your parents? Then from under the supposedly vacant counter, a husky voice answered. They disowned me, Arai said, emerging from under the counter. But you heard her, right? Heard what? That your father and mother aren't cross anymore. I'll believe that when I see it. After being crouched under the counter for a really long time, Harai was bent over like an old woman. She hobbled out into the room. As always, she had her curlers in. She was dolled up in a leopard print camisole and tight pink skirt and beach sandals. Harai winced a little. Your sister seemed really nice. When you're not in my position, I'm sure she is, yeah. Harai sat on the counter seat where Kamai had been sitting. She plucked a cigarette from her leopard print pouch and lit it. A plume of smoke rose into the air. Following it with her eyes, Harai's face showed a rare vulnerability. She looked as if her thoughts were drifted somewhere far away. Kai walked around Harai to take her position behind the counter. Do you want to talk about it? She asked. Harai blew another plume of smoke. She resents me. What do you mean she resents you? Kai asked. She didn't want it passed down to her. Huh? Kai tilted her head sideways, unsure what Harai was talking about. The inn. The inn Harai's family ran was a well-known luxury place in Sendai, Miyagi Prefecture. Her parents had planned for Harai to take over the inn, but she had a falling out with them 13 years earlier and it was decided that Kamai would be the successor. Her parents were in good health, but they were getting on in years, and as a future manager, Kamai had already taken over so many of the inn's responsibilities. Since Kamai had accepted she would take over, she regularly made the trek to Tokyo to visit Harai and tried to persuade her to come home. I keep telling her I don't want to go home, but she keeps on asking time and time and time again. Harai bent the fingers of both hands one by one as if she was counting the times. Saying that she was persistent would be an understatement, but you don't have to hide from her. I don't want to see it. See what? Her face. Kai tilted her head inquisitively. I see it written on her face. Because of what I did, she is now going to be the owner of an inn she doesn't want to run. She wants me to come home so that she can be free, Harai said. I don't really see how that can be written on her face, Kai suggested doubtfully. Harai knew Kai well enough to know she was probably struggling to picture this. Her very literal mind sometimes missed the point. What I mean, Harai said, is it just feels like she is pressuring me. Frowning, she blew out another plume of smoke. Kai stood there thoughtfully, tilting her head to the side several times. Oh God, is that the time? Oh dear, Harai sighed dramatically. She quickly stubbed out her cigarette in the ashtray. I've got a bar to open. She stood up and gingerly stretched from the hips. You sure feel it in your back after 3 hours crouched down like that? Harai thumped her lower back and headed quickly for the entrance, her beach sandals flip-flopping loudly. Hold on! The letter! Kai picked up the letter Kamai had given her and presented it to Harai. Throw it away! Harai said without looking, waving it away dismissively with her right hand. You're not going to read it? I can imagine what it says. It's really tough for me by myself. Please come home. It's okay if you learn the ropes once you're there. You know, that sort of stuff. As she spoke, Harai pulled out her dictionary-sized purse from her leopard print pouch. She put the money for the coffee on the counter. See you later, she said, and left the cafe, clearly desperate to get away. I can't just throw it away. Kai's face showed her dilemma as she looked at the letter from Kamai. While Kai was standing frozen like this, the bell rang again and Kazuka took her into the cafe, taking the place of Harai. Kazuka had gone out today with Nagia, and the cafe's owner and her cousin, to buy supplies. She returned carrying several shopping bags in both hands. The car key was jangling with other keys on the key ring hanging off her ring finger. She was dressed casually, wearing a t-shirt and blue jeans. This was in stark contrast to the bow tie and cute apron she wore when working. Welcome back, said Kai, still holding the letter. Sorry we took so long. No, it was fine. It was pretty quiet. I'll get changed right away. Kazuya's face was always more expressive before she put on a bow tie. She stuck out her tongue cheekily and darted into the back room. Kai kept holding the letter. Where's that damn husband of mine? She called out to the back room, looking at the entrance. Kazuya and Nagia did the shopping together. This wasn't because there was so much to buy, but Nagia was a difficult shopper. He would get so caught up with wanting to buy the best that he would often go over budget. It was Kazuya's job to tag along and make sure he didn't. While they were gone, Kai handled the cafe alone. Sometimes when Nagia was unable to find the ingredients he wanted, he would get in a stink and go out drinking. He said he'll probably be late coming back, Kazuya said. Oh, I bet he's gone drinking again. Kazuya poked her head out. I'll take over now, she said apologetically. Oh, I don't believe that man, Kai said, puffing out her cheeks. She retreated to the back room, still holding the letter. The only people left in the cafe were the woman in the dress quietly reading her novel and Fusagi. Despite it being summer, they were both drinking hot coffee. There were two reasons for this. Firstly, you received free refills with hot coffee. And secondly, the coffee being hot didn't bother these two customers. I was always cool inside the cafe, and they sat there for so long anyway. Kazuya soon reappeared dressed in her normal waitress's uniform. Summer had only just begun, but today it was over 30 degrees Celsius outside. She had walked less than 100 metres from the car park, but the sweat still beaded on her face. She exhaled sharply while wiping her brow with a handkerchief. Excuse me? Said Fusagi, who had lifted his head from his magazine. Yes? Said Kazuya as if something had surprised her. May I have a refill, please? Oh, sure! She let her usual cool demeanour slip and replied in the casual tone she had used while wearing a t-shirt just earlier. Fusagi had his eyes glued on Kazuya as she walked into the kitchen. When he came to the cafe, Fusagi always sat in the same chair. If another customer was sitting there, he would leave rather than sit anywhere else. Rather than coming every day, he normally made an appearance 2 or 3 times a week, sometime after lunch. He would open up his travel magazine and look through it from cover to cover while occasionally jotting down notes. He would usually stay as long as it took to finish the magazine. The only thing he ever ordered was a hot coffee. The coffee served at the cafe was made from mocha beans grown in Ethiopia, which have a distinct aroma, but it didn't appeal to everybody's tastes. Though it was deliciously aromatic, some found its bitter fruitiness and complex overtones a little overbearing. On Agear's insistence, the cafe only served mocha. Fusagi happened to like this coffee, and he seemed to find the cafe a comfortable space to leisurely read his magazine. Kazuo returned from the kitchen holding the glass carafe to pour Fusagi his refill. Standing by his table, Kazuo picked up the cup by the saucer. Fusagi would normally get time to read his magazine while waiting for her to pour his refill, but today was different. He looked directly at her with a strange expression. Sensing that his manner was different from usual, she thought he must want something else beside the coffee refill. "Is there anything else?" she asked with a smile. He smiled at her politely, looking a little embarrassed. "Are you a new waitress here?" he asked. Her expressions didn't change as she placed the cup in front of Fusagi. Was all that she replied. "Oh, really?" he replied a little bashfully. He seemed pleased to have communicated with the waitress that he was a regular customer, but satisfied with that, he immediately lowered his head and returned to reading his magazine. Kazuo went about her work with a deadpan expression as if nothing was out of the ordinary, but with no other customers there was not much to do. Her only work at that moment was wiping some washed glasses and plates with a tea towel and returning them to the shelf. As she went about this task, she started talking to Fusagi. In this small, intimate cafe, it was quite easy to hold a conversation from such a distance without raising one's voice. "So, do you come here often?" He lifted his head. "Yes." She went on, "Do you know about this place? Have you heard this urban legend?" "Yes, I know all about it." "About that seat as well?" "Yes." "So are you one of those customers planning on going back in time?" "Yes, I am," he replied without hesitation. She let her hands pause briefly. "If you return to the past, what are you planning to do?" But realising this question was too intrusive and not something she would normally ask, she immediately backtracked. "That was a rude thing to ask. I'm sorry." She bowed her head and returned to her wiping, avoiding his gaze. He looked at her with her head bowed and quietly picked up his zipped portfolio. From it, he pulled out a plain brown envelope. Its four corners were crumpled as though he had been carrying it around for a long time. There was no address on the envelope, but it looked like a letter. He held this letter tentatively in both hands, holding it up a little in front of his chest for her to see. "What's that?" she asked, pausing once again in what she was doing. "For my wife," he muttered in a quiet voice. "It's for my wife." "Is that a letter?" "Yeah." "For your wife?" "Yeah, I never managed to give it to her." "So you want to return today and you meant to pass it to her?" "Yeah, that's right," he answered once again without any hesitation. "So where is your wife now?" she asked. Rather than answering straight away, he paused in awkward silence. She stood looking squarely at him, waiting for him to answer. "I don't know," he said in a barely discernible voice, as he began to scratch his head. After this admission, his expression had hardened. She said nothing in reply. Then, as if not offering an excuse, he said, "But I really had a wife." And then he hastily added, "Her name was..." He began tapping his head with his finger. That's odd." He tilted his head. "What was her name?" he said, and went quiet again. At some time during this, Kai had turned from the back room. Her face looked drained, maybe because she had just witnessed Kazuo and Fusagi's exchange. "Oh, that's odd. I'm sorry," Fusagi said, forcing an awkward smile. Kazuo's face showed a subtle mix of emotions. It wasn't quite her normal cool expression, but nor was she showing much empathy. "Don't worry about it," she said. Kazuo silently looked to the entrance. "Ah!" she gasped when she saw Kitaki standing in the doorway. Kitaki worked as a nurse at the local hospital. She must have been on her way home. Instead of her nurse's uniform, she was wearing an olive green tunic and navy blue capri pants. She had a black shoulder bag on one shoulder, and she was wiping the sweat from her brow with a lilac handkerchief. Kitaki casually acknowledged Kai and Kazuo standing behind the counter before walking up to Fusagi's table. "Hello, Fusagi. I see you're in here again today," she said. Hearing his name, he looked up at Kitaki in puzzlement, before averting his eyes and lowering his head in silence. Kataki sensed that his mood was different from usual. She supposed he might not be feeling very well. "Fusagi, are you okay?" she asked gently. Fusagi lifted his head and looked directly at her. "I'm sorry. Have we met before?" he asked apologetically. Kataki lost her smile. In a cold silence, the lilac handkerchief she had just used to wipe her brow dropped from her hand onto the floor. Fusagi had early onset Alzheimer's disease and was losing his memory. The disease causes rapid depletion of the brain's neurocells. The brain pathologically atrophies, causing loss of intelligence and changes to the personality. One of the striking symptoms of early onset Alzheimer's is how the deterioration of brain function appears so sporadic. Sufferers forget some things but remember other things. In Fusagi's case, his memories were gradually disappearing, starting with the most recent. Meanwhile, his previously hard-to-please personality had been slowly mellowing. In that moment, Fusagi remembered that he had a wife. He didn't remember that Kataki, standing before him, was his wife. "I guess not," Kataki said quietly as she took one, then 2 steps back. Kazuo stared at Kataki while Kai pointed her pale face down on the floor. Kataki slowly turned around and walked to the seat at the counter that was the furthest from Fusagi and sat down. It was after sitting down that she noticed the handkerchief that had dropped from her hand. She decided to ignore it and pretend it wasn't hers. But Fusagi noticed the handkerchief which had fallen near his feet and picked it up. He stared at it in his hand for a while, and then he rose from his chair and walked over to the counter where Kataki was sitting. "You'll have to excuse me. Recently I've been forgetting a lot," he said, bowing his head. Kataki didn't look at him. "Okay," she said. She took the handkerchief in her trembling hand. Fusagi bowed his head again and shuffled awkwardly back to his seat. He sat down but couldn't relax. After turning several pages of his magazine, he paused and scratched his head. Then a few moments later, he reached for his coffee and took one sip. The cup had only just been refilled, but... "Damn, coffee's cold," he muttered. "Another refill?" Kazuo asked. But he stood up in a hurry. "I'll be leaving now," he said abruptly, closing the magazine and putting away his things. Kataki continued to stare at the floor with her hands on her lap as she clenched the handkerchief tightly. Fusagi moved to the cash register and handed over the bill. "How much?" 380 yen, please," Kazuo said, glancing sideways at Kataki. She punched in the amount on the cash register keys. 380 yen, Fusagi pulled out a 1,000 yen note from his well-worn leather wallet. "Right, here's 1,000, he said as he handed the note over. "Receiving 1,000 yen, Kazuo said, taking the money and punching the cash register keys. Fusagi kept glancing at Kataki, but with no apparent purpose. He appeared to just be resting looking around while waiting for the change. "That's 620 yen. Fusagi quickly reached out his hand and took the change. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, almost apologetically, and hurried out. "Thank you, come again." Upon Fusagi's departure, the cafe fell into an uncomfortable silence. The woman in the dress quietly read her book, unbothered as ever with what was going on around her. With no background music playing, the only sounds that could be heard were the constant ticking of the clocks, and the woman in the dress occasionally turning the page of her book. Kazuo first broke this long silence. "Kataki," she said, but she was unable to find the appropriate words. "It's okay. I have been mentally preparing for today." Kataki smiled at Kai and Kazuo. "Don't worry." But after speaking, she once again looked down at the floor. She had explained Fusagi's illness to Kai and Kazuo before, and Nagir and Harai knew about it too. She had resigned herself to the fact that one day he would completely forget who she was. She was also preparing herself. "If it happens," she thought, "I will care for him as a nurse. I am a nurse, so I can do that." Early onset Alzheimer's disease progresses differently for each individual, depending on a whole range of factors which include age, gender, the cause of illness and the treatment. Fusagi's rate of deterioration was progressing rapidly. Kataki was still in shock from his forgetting who she was. She was struggling to get things straight in her head whilst the general mood was so low. She turned to Kai, but she was in the kitchen. Almost instantly she appeared holding a half-gallon bottle of sake. "A gift from a customer," Kai said as she put it down on the table. "Drink anyone?" she asked with smiling eyes, still red from crying. The name on the label was 7 Happinesses. Kai's spur-of-the-moment decision had introduced a ray of light into the gloomy atmosphere and eased the tension between the three. Kataki was in two minds about drinking, but was reluctant to pass up a chance. "Well, just one," she said. Kataki was simply thankful for that the mood had changed. She had heard that Kai often acted on impulse, but she had never experienced her sense of fun at a moment like this. Her eye had often mentioned Kai's talent for living happily. She may have responded a few moments earlier, but now she was looking at Kitaki with wide, bright eyes. Kitaki found staring into those eyes a strangely calming experience. I'll see if I can find some nibbles to go with it, Kazuo said, disappearing into the kitchen. Why don't we warm the sake? No, it's okay. Right, we'll drink it as it is. Kai removed the lid deftly and poured the sake into the rolled glasses she had set out. Kitaki let out a chuckle as Kai placed a glass in front of her. Thank you, she said with a thin smile. Kazuo returned with a tin of pickles. This was all I could find. She put down a small dish, tipped the pickles onto it and set 3 small forks on the counter. Oh yum, Kai said, but I can't drink myself. She brought out a carton of orange juice from the fridge under the counter and poured herself a glass. None of the 3 women were that particular about sake, especially Kai, who didn't drink. 7 Happinesses earned its name from the claim that those who drank it would obtain 7 different types of happiness. It was transparent, pigment-free, top-shelf sake. The 2 drinkers did not take much notice of this premium sake's subtle glacial hue, nor its fruity aroma, but it went down well and delivered on the happy feeling its label had promised. As Kitaki inhaled the sweet aroma, she recalls one summer day some 15 years ago when she first visited the cafe. There had been a heat wave in Japan that summer. Recorded temperatures were continually reported throughout the country. Day after day, the television discussed the unusual weather, often alluding to global warming. Fusagi had taken a day off from work as they had gone shopping together. That day was a real scorcher. Hot and bothered from the heat, Fusagi pleaded that they take refuge somewhere cool, and together they searched for a suitable place, like a cafe. The problem was that everyone had the same idea. None of the cafes or family restaurants they spotted had empty seats. By chance, they saw a small sign in a narrow back alley. The cafe's name was Funiculi Funicula. It's the same name as a song Kitaki once knew. It was a long time since she'd heard it, but she still remembered the melody clearly. The lyrics were about climbing a volcano. The thought of red-hot lava on this summer day made everything seem even hotter, and dew-like beads of sweat formed on Kitaki's brow. However, when they opened the heavy wooden door and entered, the cafe was refreshingly cool. The clang dong of the bell was also comforting, and even though it had 3 two-seater tables and a 3-seater counter, the only customer there was a woman in a white dress seated furthest from the entrance. Thanks to a stroke of luck, they had made a real find. What a relief, Fusagi said and chose the table closest to the entrance. He quickly ordered iced coffee from the woman with the bright eyes who brought them glasses of cold water. Iced coffee for me too, please, Kitaki said, sitting opposite him. Fusagi must have been uncomfortable with the seating arrangement as he moved and sat at the counter. This didn't upset Kitaki. She was used to such behaviour from him. She was just thinking how wonderful it was to find such a relaxing cafe so close to the hospital where she worked. The thick pillars and the massive wooden beam that cut across the ceiling were lustrous dark brown, like the colour of chestnuts. Mounted on the walls were 3 large wall clocks. Kitaki didn't know much about antiques, but she could tell that these were from an earlier period. The walls were tan, made of earth and plaster, with a wonderful patina of obscure stains that had obviously built up over many years. It was daytime outside, but in this windowless cafe there was no sense of time. Dim light gave the cafe a sepia hue. All this created a comforting retro atmosphere. It had been incredibly cool in the cafe, but there was no sign of an air conditioner. A wooden blade fan fixed to the ceiling was slowly rotating, but that was all. Telling how strange it was that this cafe was so cool, Kitaki asked both Kai and Nagir about it. Neither provided satisfactory answers. They just said, "It's been like this since long ago." Kitaki took a real shine to the atmosphere and to the personalities of Kai and the others, and so she began to come often during her breaks from work. "Cheer!" Kazuo was going to say cheers, but stopped herself, screwing up her face as if she'd committed a faux pas. "I guess it's not a celebration, is it?" "Well, come on, let's not be too down," Kai said glumly. She turned to Kitaki and smiled sympathetically. Kitaki held up her glass in front of Kazuo. "I'm sorry." "No, it's fine." Kitaki smiled reassuringly and clanked glasses with her. This harmonious clank, unexpected and cheerful, sounded throughout the room. Kitaki took a sip of 7 Happinesses, its gentle sweetness and spread through her mouth. "It's been half a year since you started calling me by my maiden name," she began, speaking softly. "It's silently progressing, feeding away, slowly but steadily feeding away. His memory of me, that is." She laughed softly. "I have been mentally preparing myself for this, she said. As Kaya listened, her ears were again slowly reddening. "But it's okay, honestly," Kitaki hastened to add, waving her hand reassuringly. "Hey guys, I'm a nurse. Look, even if my identity is totally erased from his memory, I'll be part of his life as a nurse. I'll still be there for him. Kataki had put on her most confident voice to reassure Kai and Kazu. She meant what she said, just putting on a brave face, but her bravery was real, and I can still be there for him because I'm a nurse. Kazu was playing with her glass, staring at it with a deadpan expression. Kai's eyes welled up again and a single teardrop fell. The sound came from behind Kataki. The woman in the dress had closed her book. Kataki turned around to see the woman in the dress placing the closed novel on the table. She took her handkerchief from her white purse, rose from the table and headed towards the toilet. The woman in the dress walked silently. Had they not heard the novel close, they might never even have noticed she had gone. Kataki's eyes stayed glued to her movements, but Kai just glanced at her and Kazu took a sip of 7 happinesses and didn't even look up. After all, it was just an ordinary daily occurrence for them. That reminds me. I wonder why Fusagi wants to return to the past, Kataki said, staring at the seat vacated by the woman in the dress. She knew, of course, that was the seat for returning to the past. Before the Alzheimer's disease took hold, Fusagi was not the type of person who believed in such tales. When Kataki casually mentioned the rumour that this cafe could send you back to the past, he would scoff. He didn't believe in ghosts or the paranormal. But after he started to lose his memory, the once sceptical Fusagi started to come to the cafe and waited for the woman in the dress to leave her seat. When Kataki first heard of this, she found it hard to believe. But personality change is one of the symptoms of Alzheimer's, and now that the disease had progressed, Fusagi had merely become very absent-minded. In light of such changes, Kataki had decided that it wasn't particularly strange that he had changed what he believed in. But why did he want to return to the past? Kataki was very curious. She asked him on several occasions, but he just said, "It's a secret." "Apparently he wants to give you a letter," Kazu said, as if reading Kataki's mind. "Give it to me?" "Uh-huh. A letter?" Fusagi said it was something he never managed to give you. Kataki was silent. Then she replied matter-of-factly, "I see." Uncertainty swept across Kazu's face. Kataki's reaction to this news was unexpectedly cool. Was it impertinent to have mentioned it? But Kataki's response wasn't anything to do with Kazu. The real reason for her current response was the fact that Fusagi, having written her a letter, didn't make much sense. After all, he was never any good at reading or writing. Fusagi had grown up poor in a small derelict town. His family was in the seaweed trade and every member helped out, but helping out affected his schoolwork so badly that he never learned to write anything more than hiragana and 100 or so kanji characters, roughly what a child would normally learn in the first years of elementary school. Kataki and Fusagi were introduced to each other via a mutual acquaintance. Kataki was 21 while Fusagi was 26. This is before everyone had mobile phones, so they communicated by landline and letters. Fusagi wanted to be a landscape gardener and lived wherever he worked. Kataki had started nursing college, which further reduced their opportunities to meet. They did communicate though, by letter. Kataki wrote all kinds of things in her letters. She wrote about herself, of course. She wrote about what went on at the nursing college, of good books she had read, and dreams of the future. She wrote of events which ranged from the mundane to the major news of the day, explaining in detail her feelings and reactions. Sometimes the letters were as long as 10 pages. Fusagi's replies, on the other hand, were always short. But even times he would send one-line replies like, "Thanks for the interesting letter," or "I know just what you mean." At first, Kataki thought he must be busy with work and didn't have time to reply. But in letter after letter, Fusagi continued to give those brief replies. She took this to mean that he wasn't very interested in her. Kataki wrote in her letter that if he wasn't interested, then he shouldn't bother replying, and that with this letter she would stop writing if she didn't get a reply. Fusagi normally replied within a week, but not this time. There was still nothing after a month. This was a shock to Kataki. Certainly his replies were short, but they never sounded negative, like they had been written out of obligation. On the contrary, they had always seemed frank and genuine, but she wouldn't give up quite yet. In fact, she was still waiting 2.5 months after she had sent the ultimatum. Then one day, after those 2 months, a letter arrived from Fusagi. All it said was, "Let's get married." Those few words managed to move her in a way she had never felt before, but Kataki found it hard to reply properly to such a letter. Fusagi having opened his heart in such a way. In the end, she simply wrote, "Yes, let's." It wasn't until later that she learned he could barely read or write. When she found out, she asked him how he managed to read all the long letters she wrote to him. Apparently, he just allowed his eyes to wander over them. Then he just wrote in his reply the vague impression he got from his gazing. But with the last letter, after casting his eyes over it, he was overcome with a feeling that he had missed something important. He read it word by word while asking different people to tell him what the words were. Hence the long time it took to reply. Kotake still looked like she couldn't believe it. It was a brown envelope about this size, said Kazu, drawing in the air with her fingers. A brown envelope? Using a brown envelope for a letter sounded like something Fusagi would do, but it still didn't make sense to Kotake. A love letter, perhaps? Suggested Kai, her eyes sparkling innocently. Katai smiled wryly. No, not a chance, she said, dismissing the idea and waving with a wave of her hands. But if it was a love letter, what will you do? Kazu asked with an awkward smile. She didn't normally pry into people's private lives, but perhaps she was running with the idea that it was a love letter to help get rid of the dark mood that had, until then, hung in the air. Also eager to change the subject, Kotake willingly accepted the love letter theory proposed to those by who were unaware of how awful Fusagi was at reading and writing. I suppose I would want to read it, she replied with a grin. That was no lie. If he had written her a love letter, of course she wanted to read it. Why would not go back and see? Kai said. What? Kotake looked at Kai, her face blank with incomprehension. Kazuo responded to Kai's crazy idea and by hurriedly placing her glass on the counter. Sis, seriously, she said, bringing her face close to Kai's. She should read it, Kai said assertively. Kai, my love, hold on, Kotake said, trying hard to slow her down, but it was already too late. Kai was breathing heavily and was not interested in Kotake's efforts to restrain her. If it's a love letter that Fusagi wrote to you, you need to receive it. Kai was convinced it was a love letter, and as long as she had this in her mind, she wouldn't be stopped. Kotake had known her long enough to realise that. Kazuo didn't look like she was particularly comfortable with where this was going, but she just sighed and smiled. Kotake once again looked at the seat vacated by the woman in the dress. She had heard the rumour about Return to the Past. She also knew about the various frustrating rules and never, not once, had she ever contemplated going back in time herself. She was even uncertain as to whether the rumour was true. But if, say, it was true, she was now definitely interested in trying it. She wanted more than anything to know what the letter contained. If what Kazuo said was right, if she was able to return to the day that Fusagi had planned to give it to her, she saw a glimmer of hope that she might still get to read it. She had, however, a dilemma. Now that she knew Fusagi wanted to go back in time to give her a letter, was it right to go back to the past to receive it? She was in two minds. It seemed wrong to get hold of that letter that way. She took a deep breath and took stock of the current situation calmly. She remembered the rule that going back in time would not change the present, no matter how much she tried. That meant even if she returned to the past and read that letter, nothing would change. It won't change, Kazuo said bluntly, when Kotake asked to double check. Kotake felt something large stirring in her heart, so no change to the present meant that even if she went back and took it, Fusagi would, in the present, still be intending to return to the past to give her the letter. She gulped down her glass of 7 happinesses. It was just the time to set her resolve. Exhaling deeply, she put the glass down on the counter. That's right, she muttered to herself. If it's really a love letter written for me, how can it be a problem if I read it? Calling it a love letter dispelled her feelings of guilt. Kai nodded vigorously in agreement and gulped down the orange juice as if to express solidarity with her. Her nostrils flared excitedly. Kazuo did not join the other two in downing her drink. She quietly placed the glass on the counter and disappeared into the kitchen. Kotake stood in front of the seat that would transport her. Feeling her blood pumping through her body, she carefully squeezed in between the chair and the table and sat down. The cafe's chairs all looked like antiques, elegantly shaped with cabriole legs. The seats and back were upholstered in a moss green fabric, and Kotake suddenly saw them in a fresh light. She noticed that all the chairs were in excellent condition as if they were brand new, but it wasn't just the chairs either. The entire cafe was sparkling clean. If this cafe opened at the beginning of the Meiji period, it must have been operating for more than 100 years. There was not the slightest hint of mustiness. She sighed in admiration. She knew that in order to keep this cafe looking this way, someone must be spending a lot of time each day cleaning it. She looked to her side to see standing there Kazuo, who had approached without Kotake noticing her. Standing there so quietly, there was something eerie about her appearance. She was carrying a silver tray, on which there were a white coffee cup and, instead of the glass carafe normally used to serve customers, a small silver kettle. Kotake's heart skipped a beat as she saw how stunning Kazuo looked. Her normal girlish qualities had disappeared. And now she wore an expression that was both elegant and intimidatingly somber. "You're familiar with the rules, right?" Kazuo asked in a casual but distant tone. Katake hurriedly went through the rules in her mind. The first rule was that when returned to the past, the only people one could meet were those who had visited the cafe. "That's no problem for me," thought Katake. "Fusagi had visited here countless times." The second rule was that the present wouldn't be changed by returning to the past, no matter how hard one tried. Katake had already reassured herself that this rule wasn't a problem. Of course, this did not only apply to letters. If, for example, a revolutionary treatment for Alzheimer's disease was discovered and somehow taken back to the past to be tried on Fusagi, it would be unable to improve his condition. It seemed an unkind rule. The third rule was that in order to return to the past, one had to sit in this seat in particular. By chance, the woman in the dress had gone to the toilet just at that moment. The narrow window of opportunity was perfectly timed for Katake to take advantage of. She had also heard, although didn't know if it was true, if you tried to forcefully remove the woman in the dress from her seat, she would curse you. So coincidence or not, Katake felt lucky indeed. The fourth rule was that when one returned to the past, it was not possible to remove from the chair in which one was seated. It wasn't that you weren't stuck in the chair, rather if you did get up, you would be forcibly be brought back to the present. As this cafe was in a basement, there was no mobile phone signal, hence there was no chance of going back and calling someone who wasn't there. Also, not being able to leave your seat meant you couldn't go outside, yet another detestable rule. Katake had heard that several years ago the cafe had become quite famous, attracting a throng of customers who all wanted to return to the past. With all these maddening rules, no wonder people stopped coming, she thought. Katake suddenly realised that Kazuo was silently waiting for her reply. "I have to drink the coffee before it gets cold." "Yes." "Is there anything else?" There was one other thing she wanted to know. How could she make sure that she returned to the right date and time? "You need to form a strong image of the day you want to return to," Kazuo added, as if reading her mind. Simply being asked to form an image was rather vague. "An image?" Katake asked. "A day before Fusagi got you, a day when he was thinking of passing you the letter, and a day when he brought the letter with him to the cafe. A day when he still remembered her." It was a rough guess, but she remembered a day in summer 3 years ago. It was a time before Fusagi had shown any symptoms. A day when he meant to hand her the letter? This was difficult. If she hadn't received it, how could she know? Yet it would be meaningless to return to a day before he had written the letter. She decided she'd simply visualise an image of Fusagi writing to her. And a day when he brought the letter with him to the cafe. This one was important. Even if she managed to go back in time and meet him, if he didn't have the letter, everything would become pointless. Luckily, she knew that he normally put all his important things in his black zip portfolio and would carry this with him. If it was a love letter, he wouldn't leave it lying around at home. He would definitely be carrying it with him in his zip portfolio so that she wouldn't happen upon it. She didn't know the day when he meant to give it to her, but where there was a bag, there was a way. She formed an image of Fusagi carrying the zipper portfolio with him. "Are you ready?" said Kazuo in a calm, quiet voice. Just a moment. She took a deep breath. She formed the images one more time. "Day he doesn't forget. Letter. Day he came," she chanted softly. "Okay, enough messing around. I'm ready," she said, staring directly to Kazuo's eyes. Kazuo gave a small nod. She set the empty coffee cup in front of Katake and carefully picked up the silver kettle from the tray in the right hand. Her ballerina-like motions were efficient and beautiful. "Just remember," Kazuo paused facing Katake with downcast eyes, "drink the coffee before it gets cold." These soft words echoed through the silent cafe. Katake sensed how tense the atmosphere had become. With a serious and ceremonial air, Kazuo began pouring coffee into the cup. A thin stream of pitch-black coffee poured from the narrow spout of the silver kettle. Unlike the gurgling sound made by coffee poured from a carafe with a wide mouth, the coffee filled the white coffee cup silently over ever so slowly. Katake had never seen such a kettle before. It was a little smaller than those she had seen at other cafes. Solidly built, it looked very elegant and refined. The coffee is probably special as well, she thought. As such thoughts were passing through her mind, a wisp of steam rose from the now filled cup. At that moment, everything around Katake began to ripple and shimmer. Her entire field of vision suddenly seemed surreal. She recalled the glass of 7 happinesses she recently downed. Perhaps I'm feeling its effects? No, this was definitely different. What she was experiencing was far more alarming. Her Her body had also begun rippling and shimmering, and she had become with the steam coming off the coffee. It seemed as if everything around her was unravelling. Kataki closed her eyes, not out of fear, but an attempt to focus. She indeed was now travelling back in time, and she wanted to mentally prepare herself. The very first time Kataki noticed the change of Usagi, it was because of something he said. On the day he admitted out loud what had happened, Kataki was preparing dinner while waiting for him to come home. A landscape gardener's work does not simply involve pruning branches and raking leaves. He has to consider the balance between the house and the garden. The garden cannot be too colourful, nor can it be too plain. The key word is balance. That was what Usagi had always said. His workday began early but finished at dusk. Unless there was a particular reason not to, Usagi would have come home straight away. So when Kataki didn't have a night shift, she would wait for him and they would eat together. On this occasion, night came, but Usagi had still not come home. This was unusual behaviour, but Kataki assumed she must have gone out drinking with colleagues. When finally he did come home, it was 2 hours later than usual. Normally when he came home, he would always ring the doorbell 3 times, but that night he didn't ring. Instead, Kataki had the sound of the doorknob turning and a voice from outside saying, "It's me." On hearing his voice, she rushed and opened the door in panic. She thought he must have hurt himself in some way that prevented him from ringing the doorbell. But there he was, looking as he always did, just simply in his grey gardening smock with his navy breeches. He had taken his tool bag from his shoulder and, looking a little ashamed of himself, admitted, "I got lost." That happened around the end of summer 2 years ago. Being a nurse, Kataki had been trained to recognise early symptoms of a whole range of illnesses. This was more than simply forgetting something. She was sure of it. Soon after he began to forget whether or not he had done a task at work. After the illness had progressed a bit further, he would wake in the night and say out loud, "I forgot to do something important." When this happened, she would argue with him. She focused on calming him and reassuring him that they could check it up in the morning. She even consulted a doctor behind his back. She was keen to try anything that might slow the advancement of his disease, even by just a little. But as the days went on, he began to forget more and more. He liked to travel. It wasn't the travel itself that he liked, it was the opportunity to visit gardens in different places. Kataki always arranged to take her holidays at the same time as him so they could go together. He would complain and say he was going for work, but that didn't bother her. While on a trip, his brow seemed permanently frowned. But she knew that this was how he looked whenever he was doing something he liked. Even as the illness progressed, he didn't stop travelling, but he did start visiting the same destinations over and over again. After a while, the illness began to affect their daily lives. They lived in an apartment they had moved to after getting married, but he began not coming home and she would frequently get calls from the police. Then about 6 months ago, he started calling her by her maiden name, Kataki. Finally, the dizzy sensation of rippling and shimmering faded. Kataki opened her eyes. She saw the slowly rotating ceiling fan. Her hands and her feet. She was no longer steam. However, she didn't know whether she had actually gone back in time. The cafe had no windows and the lighting was always dim. Unless one looked at a watch, there was no way of knowing whether it was day or night. The 3 solid-looking clocks on the wall all showed completely different times. But something was different. Kazu had vanished. Kai was nowhere to be seen either. Kataki tried to calm herself, but she was unable to stop her heart from beating faster and faster. Once again, she looked around the cafe. "There's no one here," she muttered. The absence of Usagi, who she had gone back to meet, was a huge disappointment. She looked at the ceiling fan in a daze and considered her plight. It was a shame, but perhaps it was for the best. Actually, in some ways, she was relieved. Of course, she wanted to read the letter, but she couldn't help feeling guilty in that she was sneaking a peek, so to speak. Usagi would have surely been cross to learn that she had come from the future to read what he had written. It wasn't as if anything she did would change the present anyway. It didn't matter if she never read it. If by reading it his condition would somehow improve, then of course she would. But she would give her life for that. But the letter had nothing to do with his condition. It wouldn't change the fact that he had forgotten her either. So coolly and rationally considered her predicament. Just earlier, she had the shock of him asking her whether they'd met before. It really upset her. She had known this time would come, but still caught her off balance and brought her here. She was beginning to feel more composed. If this was the past, then it held of nothing of use. As she returned to the present, even if I am a stranger to Fusagi, I can be his nurse, I must do what I can. She remembered her heart's resolve and reaffirmed it. I doubt it, love letter, she muttered to herself as she reached out for a cup of coffee. Someone had entered the cafe. To enter this cafe, one has to descend stairs from the ground level and go in through a large door about 2 meters high, made out of solid wood. It's when this door opens that the bell sounds, but the visitor does not immediately appear at the entrance, as a small patch of flooring must be crossed first. Once the bell rings, there is a time lag of a few seconds before the visitor takes those 1 or 2 steps and enters the cafe. So when the bell rang, Kotake had no idea who had come. Was it Nagir or Kai? She noticed how nervous the suspense was making her. Her heart was racing in excitement. It wasn't the kind of thing she normally did. And once a lifetime experience to be exact. If it was Kai, she would probably ask me why. Kazu, on the other hand, would probably just deliver her usual customer service. That would probably be a disappointment. Kotake played out various scenarios in her mind, but the person who appeared was neither Kai nor Kazu. Standing in the doorway was Fusagi. Oh, Kotake said. A sudden appearance had taken her by surprise. It was him she had come back to see, but she hadn't been expecting him to walk into the cafe right then. He was wearing a navy polo shirt and beige knee-length shorts. It's what he often wore on his days off. It must have been hot outside, as he was fanning himself with his black zippered portfolio. She sat unmoving in the chair. He stood at the entrance for a while, staring at her with an odd look. Hi there, she began. She felt clueless as to how she was going to approach what she had come to talk about. But he had never stared at her like this, not since they met, let alone since they'd been married. It was both flattering and embarrassing. She had formed a hazy image of 3 years ago, but she didn't know how to make sure that was where she was. Maybe she hadn't imagined it right. If that was the case, what was to say that by some mistake she got the 3 right, but she'd only returned to 3 days ago? Just when she began to think she may have been too vague. Oh, hello. I didn't expect to see you here, he said matter-of-factly. Fusagi sounded like he had before he became ill. He was as she had pictured him, that is to say, he was how she remembered him. I was waiting, but he didn't come home, he added. He looked away from her gaze and coughed nervously with a furrowed brow, as if uncomfortable with something. So it's really you, she said. Huh? You know who I am? What? I looked at her with make sure it was obvious that she could cut to the path, but when? Before or after the onset of Alzheimer's? My name, she said. Are you going to stop messing with me? He spat out crossly. Though he hadn't answered the question, she smiled with relief. No, it's okay, she said, shaking her head a little. Their short exchange told her everything she needed to know. She had definitely gone back. The Fusagi standing before her was Fusagi from before he had lost his memory. And if the image she pictured had worked, it was the Fusagi of 3 years ago. Kotake smiled as she gave her coffee an unnecessary stir. Fusagi observed Kotake and her particular behaviour. You're acting a bit strange today, he said, looking around the cafe as if he had just realised no one else was here. Nagir, you here? He called to the kitchen. With no reply, he went behind the counter, flapping his set of sandals as he walked. He peeked into the back room, but no one was there. That's odd. No one's here, he grumbled. He sat down on the counter seat furthest away from Kotake. She coughed on purpose to get his attention. He looked at her, fed up. What is it? Why are you sitting there? Why not? What's stopping me? Why not come and sit here? She rapped on the table to beckon him to sit in the empty seat facing her, but he winced at the idea. No, I'm fine, he replied. Oh, come on now, why not? A mature married couple sitting down together like that? Nah, Fusagi said, a little crossly. The crevice between his brows deepened. He was dismissive of the idea, but when his brow furrowed in that way, it wasn't that he was displeased. On the contrary, it was a sign that he was in a good mood. She knew all too well that this was meant to conceal his embarrassment. True, we are a married couple, she agreed, smiling. She was happy to hear the word couple from his lips. Ah, don't be so sentimental. Now, anything he said brought back waves of nostalgia and happiness. She absent-mindedly sipped the coffee. Uh-oh, she said out loud, as she realised how much the coffee had cooled. It suddenly dawned on her now how limited her time there was. She had to do what she had to do before it went completely cold. Look, there's something I need to ask you. What? What is it? Is there anything you want to hand me? Kitaki's heart started racing. Fusaki had written it before the onset of his illness. It may have been a love letter. Totally impossible, she was telling herself, but if it were, her wish to read it was now running wild, reassured by the fact that no matter what she did, the present would not change. What? About this by this? She drew the size of the envelope in the air using her fingers, just as Kazu had shown her. Her direct approach provoked alarm on his face as he glared at her. Completely motionless, I'd blown it, she thought, and had seen his expression. She remembered that something similar had happened soon after they were married. Fusaki had a present ready to give her for her birthday. On the day before, by accident, she saw it among his belongings. Never before having received a present from him, she was overjoyed at the prospect of receiving this first gift. On the day of her birthday, when he had returned home from work, she was so excited that she asked him, "Don't you have something special for me today?" But on hearing this, he went very quiet. "No, nothing in particular," he said. The next day, she found her present in the bin. It was a lilac handkerchief. She felt she had repeated the same mistake. He hated being told to do something that had been mean to do himself. Now she feared that even if he was carrying the letter, he would never give it to her, especially if it was a love letter. She regretted her carelessness even more so because time was of the essence. He still looked alarmed. She smiled at him. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean anything. Please forget it," she said in a light-hearted way. Then, to emphasise that it didn't really matter to her either way, she tried to make small talk. "Hey, I just thought, why don't we do sukiyaki tonight?" It was his favourite dish. He seemed to be in a sulky mood, but this usually lifted his spirits. She slowly reached for her cup and felt the temperature of the coffee with her palm. It was still okay. She still had time. She could cherish those precious moments with him. She wanted to forget the letter for the time being. Judging by his reaction, he definitely had written her something. If he hadn't, he would have responded in no certain terms. What on earth are you talking about? If she allowed the current situation to play out, he would end up throwing the letter away. She decided to change strategy. She would try to alter his mood to prevent a repeat of what happened on her birthday. She looked at him, his face still serious, but then again, it was always like that. He never wanted her to think that just by hearing sukiyaki, his mood instantly lifted. He wasn't that straightforward. Even his sulky face was precious to her. It was bliss to be with him again now, but she had read the situation wrongly. "Oh, I get it. I see what's happening," he said with a gloomy look. He got up from the counter and walked over to stand in front of her. "What do you mean?" she asked, looking up at him. He was striking an imposing stance as he glared back at her. "What's wrong?" She hadn't seen him like this before. "You're from the future, aren't you?" What? What he had just said could be considered crazy, but he was right. She had come from the future. Now look, she was racking her brains trying to remember whether that was a rule that said when you go back in time, you cannot reveal you are from the future, but none existed. Look, I can explain. I thought it was strange that you're sitting in that seat. Yes, well, so that means you know about my illness. She felt her heart racing again. She thought she had been transported back to time before her disease, but she was wrong. The Fusaki standing before her knew he was ill. Just from looking at his clothes, she could tell it was summertime. She had been transported back to the summer of 2 years ago, the time when he began losing his way, when she began noticing the telltale signs of his illness. If she had gone back by little as a year, her conversation with him would have become muddled by now. Rather than 3 years ago, she returned to the day that he met with the criteria that she had imagined, a day when Fusaki had not forgotten her, a day when he was thinking of passing her the letter, and a day when he thought he brought it with him to the cafe. To have gone back 3 years, he would have meant that he had not written the letter yet. The Fusaki standing before her knew he was ill, and so it was likely that the content of the letter concerned his disease. Also, the way he reacted with such dread when she mentioned the letter seemed further evidence. "You know, don't you?" he said forcefully, pressing her to give an answer. She couldn't see how she could lie at this stage. She nodded silently. "I see," he muttered. She regained her composure. "Okay, whatever I do here, it's not going to change the present, but it might upset him. I never would have returned to the past if I thought that might happen. How embarrassing that I was all caught up in the idea of it being a love letter." She felt deep regret for coming back, but now was not the time to be wallowing. He had gone silent. "My love," she called out to the despondent-looking Fusaki. She had never seen him looking so depressed. It was heart-wrenching. He suddenly turned his back on her and walked back towards the counter where he'd been sitting. He picked up the black portfolio. From it, he peeled a brown envelope and walked back to her. His face showed no signs of wretchedness or desperation. He looked more embarrassed than anything else. He began to mumble in a throaty voice that was difficult to hear. The "you" Lynn this time doesn't know about my illness. He might be under that impression, but I already know, or will very soon. I just don't know how to tell you. He held up the brown envelope to show her. He was planning to tell her that I had Alzheimer's in this letter. But I don't need to read it. I already know. It would make more sense to give it to me in the past than me that Fusagi can't bring himself to give it to. I guess if he can't pass it to that version of me, it's okay that I take it. That's just the way things are. She decided to leave while things were as they were at that moment. She didn't want the subject of his illness to be broached. The worst case scenario was him asking about his condition in the present. If he asked how his condition progressed, who knows how he would take the awful news. She should return before he asked. Now was the time to return to the present. The coffee was now at a temperature that she could down it in one go. I can't let the coffee go cold, she said, and brought the cup close to her mouth. So I forget you, he mumbled, looking down. Hearing this, she was overwhelmed by confusion. She didn't even know why there was a coffee cup in front of her. She looked at him in trepidation. Staring at him, she noticed how forlorn his expression was now. She had never imagined that he could look that way. Lost for words, she couldn't even maintain eye contact and found herself casting her eyes down. But giving no reply, she had answered his question. I see, I feared as much, he murmured sadly. He bowed his head so deeply his neck looked like it might break. Her eyes filled with tears. After being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, he had struggled each day with the dread and anxiety of losing his memory. Yet she, his wife, had not seen how he had borne these thoughts and feelings alone. On learning that she had come from the future, the first thing he had wanted to know was whether he had forgotten her, his wife. This realisation filled her with both joy and sorrow. It gave her the strength to look at him in the face. Without wiping away her tears, she smiled broadly at him so he might interpret her tears as those of joy. Actually, your illness does get better, you know. In fact, you in the future told me. How did you have anxious moments? She wanted so much for her lie to be believed. She would do anything. She had a lump in her throat, tears streamed down her face, but maintaining her beaming smile, she continued. It will be all right. You recover. Don't worry. Every word she spoke, she delivered with all her strength. In her mind, it wasn't a lie. Even if he had forgotten who she was, even if nothing she did changed the present, he looked at her straight in the eyes, and she looked right back at him, her face streamed with tears. He looked happy. Oh, really? He said in a soft whisper. Yes, she said. He looked at her in the gentlest of ways. Looking down at the brown envelope he was holding in his hands, he slowly approached her. The distance between them was now such that a letter might be handed from one to another. Here, he said like a shy child, offering her the brown envelope that he was holding. She tried to push the letter away. But you get better, she said. And you can throw it out, he said, handing her the letter more forcefully. His tone was different from his normal gruff self. He spoke with such gentleness that it gave her the odd feeling that she must have missed something. Once again, pressed the brown envelope on her. Her trembling hand reached out and nervously took it. She wasn't really sure of his intentions. Drink up. Your coffee will go cold, he said, acknowledging the rules. The kindness in his smile seemed infinite. She nodded. It was just a small nod. With no words left, she reached for the coffee. Once she had her hands firmly on the cup, he turned his back. It was as if their time as a couple had reached its end. A large tear began to form in her eye. My love, she cried out without thinking. He did not turn round. Her shoulders appeared to be trembling ever so slightly. While watching his back, she drank the coffee in one go. She drank it in one gulp, not out of a sense of urgency that the coffee was about to go cold, but rather out of respect for Fusagi. His gentle back was turned to ensure she could quickly and safely return to the present. Such was the depth of his kindness. My darling. She felt overcome by a shimmering and rippling sensation. She returned the cup to its saucer. As her hand drew back, it seemed to dissolve into steam. All that was left to do was return to the present. This fleeting moment, when they'd once more been together as husband and wife, had ended. Suddenly he turned round, a reaction, perhaps to the sound of her cup hitting the saucer. She didn't know how he could make her out, but she seemed to be able to see her there. As her consciousness flickered and dissipated into the same, she saw his lips move a little. Unless she was mistaken, he seemed to be saying, "Thank you." Her consciousness had emerged with the steam, and she had begun a transition from past to present. The cafe around her began to fast forward. She could do nothing to stem the flow of her tears. In a blink, she realised Kazuo and Kai had reappeared in her field of vision. But she had returned to the present the day that he had completely forgotten her. One look at her expression was enough to fill Kai's face. "The letter?" she asked. "Letter, not love letter." She dropped her gaze to the brown envelope she'd been holding. She slowly removed the letter from the envelope. It was written in basic script, all squiggly like crawling worms. It was definitely Fusagi's handwriting. As Kotake read the letter, she held her right hand to her mouth to stop sobbing in her tears as her tears fell. So sudden was her outburst of tears that Kazuo was worried. "Kotake, are you okay?" she asked. Kotake's shoulders began to shudder. As gradually she began wailing, louder and louder. Kazuo and Kai stood there looking at her, unsure of what to do. After a while, she handed Kazuo the letter. Kazuo took the letter and, as if looking for permission, she looked at Kai behind the counter. Kai nodded slightly with a grave expression. Kazuo looked back at the tearful Kotake and then began to read out loud. "You're a nurse, so I could only assume you have already noticed. I have an illness where I forget things. Imagine that as I keep on losing my memory, you will be able to put up aside your own feelings and care for me with the detachment of a nurse, and that you can do that no matter what strange things I say or do, even if I forget who you are. So I ask you never to forget one thing. You are my wife, and if life becomes too hard for you as my wife, I want you to leave me. You don't have to stay by me as a nurse. I am no good as a husband, then I want you to leave me. All I ask is that you can do what you can as my wife. We're husband and wife after all. Even if I lose my memory, I want to be together as husband and wife. I cannot stand the idea of us staying together only out of sympathy. This is something I cannot say to your face, so I wrote it in a letter." When Kazuo finished reading, Kotake and Kai looked up at the ceiling and began to cry loudly. Kotake understood why Fusagi had handed this letter to her, his wife from the future. From the letter, it was clear that he had guessed what she would do after she found out about his illness. And then, when he came from the future, it became clear to him that, just as he predicted, in the future she would care for him like a nurse. Excuse me. Amid the anxiety and fear of losing his memory, he was hoping that she would continue to be his wife. She was always in his heart. There was mere proof of this to be found. Even after losing his memory, he could content himself by looking at travel magazines, opening his notebook and jotting something down. She had wanted to look at what he wrote. Had been listing destinations that he had travelled to in order to visit gardens. She had simply assumed his actions were a hangover from his love of his work as a landscape gardener. But she was wrong. The destinations he made a note of were all the places he had visited with her. She didn't notice at the time. She couldn't see. These notes were the last handhold for Fusagi, who was gradually forgetting who she was. Of course, that she had looked after him as a nurse didn't feel like a mistake to her. She believed that it was for the best, and he didn't write the letter to blame her in any way either. It seemed to her that he knew that her talk about him getting healed was a lie, but it was a lie he wanted to believe. Otherwise, she thought, he wouldn't have said thank you. After her crying had stopped, the woman in the dress returned from the toilet, stood in front of her and spoke just one word. "Move," she said in a low voice. "Sure," she said, leaping up and relinquishing the seat. The woman in the dress's reappearance was impeccably timed, coincided with a switch in Kotake's mood. Eyes swollen from crying, she looked at Kazuo and Kai. She held up the letter that Kazuo had just read and waved it. "So there you have it," she said with a grin. Kai responded by nodding, her round bright eyes still streaming with tears like a waterfall. "What have I been doing?" Kotake mumbled, looking at the letter. "Kotake," Kai sniffled, looking worried. Kotake neatly folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. "I'm going home," she said, in a bold, confident voice. Kazu gave a small nod. Kai was still sniffing. Kotake looked at the still teary-eyed Kai, who had cried longer than she had. She smiled as she thought that Kai must be getting pretty dehydrated, and let out a deep breath. No longer looking lost, she seemed empowered. She pulled out her purse from her shoulder bag on the counter and handed Kazu 380 yen in coins. Thanks, she said. With a calm expression, Kazu returned her smile. Kotake gave a quick nod and walked towards the entrance. She stepped lightly as she was in a hurry to see Fusagi's face. She passed through the doorway and out of sight. Ah, she said, and doubled back into the cafe. Kazu and Kai looked at her inquiringly. One more thing, she said. Starting tomorrow, no more calling me by my maiden name, okay? She grinned broadly. It was Kotake who originally requested that she be called by her maiden name. When Fusagi started calling her Kotake, she wanted to avoid confusion, but such consideration was not necessary now. A smile returned to Kai's face and her bright eyes opened widely. Okay, got you. Tell everyone else too, said Kotake, and without waiting for a reply, she waved and left. Okay, said Kazu, instead of speaking to herself and put the money from Kotake in the towel. Kai cleaned away the cup that Kotake had drunk from and went to the kitchen to get a refill for the woman in the dress. The clank sound of the keys of the cash register reverberated throughout the cool room. The ceiling fan continued to rotate silently. Kai returned and poured a new coffee for the woman in the dress. We appreciate your presence again this summer, she whispered. The woman in the dress continued to read her novel and did not reply. Kai placed her hands on her own stomach and smiled. Summer was getting started. And that is husband and wife. That's flaming emotional. Can't even fight these tears back. That is sad. I really hope you enjoyed it though. I really do. So that concludes the Friday. I'm sorry, I am emotional with this story. But that does conclude the Friday night story time. And I really do hope you enjoyed. Next week we go on to the next story entitled The Sisters. And I'll see you then.